Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that if you're returning. How are you today? In today's video, we're going to continue with what we had, everything but money, okay? The dust storms of the 1930s provided some unique experiences for me as a child on a South Dakota farm. 2 or 3 of us kids often watched the storms approach from the west window of our house. We could see the characteristic huge, rapidly moving cloud when a storm was miles away. We watched it roll across the fields, envelope the school building a half-mile down the road, and blot out our view of the neighbor's house. "Here it comes," we'd say. Then we'd run to the east side of the house to see if the strong wind would blow down our outhouse. Sometimes it did. A favorite chore during those years was collecting Russian thistles. Dad considered it necessary work to be done each fall, but the 3 kids who helped considered it a special celebration. We'd walk through the fields with pitchforks, collecting hundreds of these tumbleweeds, most of them wind-driven into barbed wire fences. It was fun to race a blowing thistle across the field on a windy day. The strong wind tore up the dried thistle by its shallow roots and sent it flying across the dusty field. I could run like the wind for a short distance, but often a thistle would outdistance me, so then I'd have to trail behind and catch up when the thistle was snagged on a fence or a tall weed. I know that gathering those prickly thistles and packaging them firmly into a tight stack must have been hard, sweaty work, but I only remember the joy of it. The more thistles we gathered, the larger the bonfire we would enjoy that evening. The flames shooting high and the heat waves forcing us back, we felt close to nature and each other as we watched in silence, wanting the bonfire to last forever. During the late 30s, we moved to a farm that had 2 apple trees just outside the bedroom my sister Dorothy and I shared. We'd lie across the bed and gaze at the trees' delicate pink and white blossoms, breathing deeply of their fragrance. I tried to live the moment so fully I would never forget it. We watched as the blossoms magically turned into tiny apples. I eagerly awaited the day when the apples would be ripe. Mom had been promising us apple pie, apple dumplings, apple sauce, and apples for school lunches as a rare treat. Then one fateful day, a dark cloud moved toward our farm. An ominous whirling sound emanated the cloud's ever-changing shape. As it settled on our farm of grain, millions of grasshoppers devoured our entire crop. We watched helplessly, listening to the enemy ravage our once promising field of wheat. They outnumbered us 10 million to 1. The grasshoppers weren't satisfied with just destroying our fields. They descended on our beloved apple trees too. My sister and I climbed the trees and tried to kill off the grasshoppers one by one, but they escaped us easily. I had another idea. I grabbed a large wash tub from the porch and I placed it under one tree. Dorothy and I filled the tub with water from the stock tank, then climbed the tree and tried to knock the grasshoppers into the tub so they would drown. Our mother came out of the kitchen and told us, "You can't fight grasshoppers. There's nothing you can do to stop them." She smiled as we continued our desperate efforts. "I know you want to help, but there's nothing you can do." Although I didn't want to give up, I knew Mom was right. You can't fight grasshoppers. I watched as they ate all the leaves from our trees and then attacked the tiny apples. Soon the tree was bare except for the apple cores clinging to the stripped branches. I cried then, just as I do now, writing this nearly 60 years later. It was my only experience of total defeat. Despite yet another complete crop loss, my parents accepted the situation and continued to trust in the goodness of God. The memory of that faith has influenced my whole life. It probably had a lot to do with my becoming a Francian nun. These letters were written in the 1930s by a Dust Bowl survivor from McCracken, Kansas. Wanda Childers of Elvin, Wisconsin, says the writer was one of her husband's relatives. March 24th, 1935. Dear family, did some of you think that you had a dust storm? I'll tell you what it was. It was us shaking our bedding carpets, etc. For over a week, we have been having troublesome times. The dust is something fierce. Sometimes it lets us up enough so we can see round. Even the sun may shine for a little time. Then we have a frenzied time of cleaning, anticipating the comfort of clean feeling once more. We keep the doors and windows all shut tight with wet papers on the sills. The tiny particles of dirt sift right through the walls. Two different times it has been an inch thick on my kitchen floor. Our faces look like coal miners. Our hair is gray and stiff with dirt, and we grind dirt in our teeth. We have to wash everything just before we eat it, and it makes it as snappy as possible. Sometimes there's a fog all around the house, and all we can do is sit in our dusty chairs and see that fog settle slowly and silently over everything. When we open the door, swirling whirlwinds of soil beat against us unmercifully, and we are glad to go back inside and sit choking in the dirt. We couldn't see the street light just in front of the house. One morning early, I went out during a lull, and when I started to return, I couldn't see the house. I knew the direction, so I kept on coming and was quite close before I could even see the outline. It sure made me feel funny. There hasn't been much school this week. It let up a little yesterday, and Fred went with the janitor, and they carried dirt out of the church by the scoopful. 4 of them worked all afternoon. We were able to have church this morning, but I think many stayed at home to clean. A lot of dirt is blowing now, but it's not dangerous to be out in it. The dirt is all loose. Any little wind will stir it, and there will be no relief until we get rain. If it doesn't come soon, there will be lots of suffering. If we spit or blow our noses, we get mud. We have quite a little trouble with our chests. I understand a good many may have pneumonia. As for gardens, we had ours plowed, but now we do not know whether we have more or less soil. It's useless to plant anything. Grace. April 30th, 1935. Dear family, here it is, the last day of April, and a wild day at that. I did not think when I wrote on the 24th of March that we would still be having storms. Part of the time today we can see a block. Then it will lift till we can see 2 blocks. O.E. thought I took the prize for the best dust story. Well, I've had much experience since then. It's almost useless to tell you, for you can hardly conceive how it would be. We are very, very weary fighting dirt. Yesterday was a lovely day, the first whole day we have had that there was no dust in the air. Today is making up for it. There are some days when it is nearly not so bad, and then we get out of bed and do everything we can. One day I went with Fred over to Brownell. The horizon seemed to be about 1/4 of a mile all around us. It sort of seemed we were set out in a little world by ourselves. Sunday afternoon it was not very bad. I went with some other people to see about some sick folks who lived 8 or 9 miles southwest. Along the road I saw piles of powdery dust, 5 or 6 feet deep. There have been several auto accidents caused by the dust, and This sand and dust is awful hard on car engines. We have had two small local showers, which would clear the air for a half a day, but soon it would be coming again for the dry regions. I think Brunel has had a drop of rain yet. Cows look pitiful. Many people are not able to buy feed around town. Here we have some grass, which our little rain started, but out there, where there was no rain, there's nothing. When the storms came within miles, there was so much electricity in the air, it interfered with much of our radio. One fellow was telling us that he had turned it off, but it still seemed to make noise. Grace. The years of 1933 and 1935 brought Dust Bowl days to the Texas Panhandle. It was a bleak time, and memories of it are painful. The Weather Bureau in Amarillo reported 192 dust storms in that 3-year period. I believe there were more. I was a young girl then, and looking back, those years were like a dream, unreal and unbelievable. It was eerie to look across the countryside and see curtains of thick sand blowing with thousands of tumbleweeds rolling ahead of the dust, spinning on until they were caught by the fence rows. A dust storm was like a monster devouring the topsoil as it moved along, leaving high drifts of sand against buildings and anything else that stood in its path. There were times it became dark as night in the afternoon and chickens went to roost. Often we'd waken to a bright, clear morning, and as my sisters and I walked the 1.5 miles to school, we'd be hit by a dust storm. We didn't turn back, we plowed on. A dust storm was no excuse for missing school. Walking into the dust was difficult because bits of gravel would hit us in the face. We walked with our backs to the storm to help us move along. One of my fond memories is of an older boy taking off his coat and holding it in front of my face to protect me from the cruel wind. Visibility was only a few feet. If we walked in the middle of the road, we could not even see if the telephone poles across the ditch. Keeping the house clean and doing laundry was a never-ending job. There were times we could write our names in the sand on our table. A slow lick of the lips would taste like a taste of mud. Eating sometimes came to a halt because dust had fallen in our food, giving it a gritty taste. Breathing was difficult for those with respiratory problems. My sister Midge often covered her face with a wet cloth so she could breathe. The most memorable storm of all was on April 14th, 1935. Black Sunday. I remember that terrible day. We had retired early, like most farm people, and were in bed by 9 p.m. A gorgeous bright moon illuminated the countryside, almost like daylight. My brother Otis and Winfred came from church and told us they'd heard a report on the radio that the blackest dust storm we'd ever experienced was moving in. At 10 o'clock, it arrived like an ocean of dust engulfing us. The moon was instantly diminished by the blackness and did not reappear all night. The next morning was bright and clear. The storm had left as quietly as it came, but it left gallons of black dust behind. Farmers said it was topsoil from Kansas. Rainfall during those years was scant and harvest almost nil. There was little pasture, so the cows gave only small amounts of milk. When describing the dust bowls in later years, Mama said the coyotes' howls pierced the stillness of the night like never before, and they were hungry too. A popular sound during that time was rain. When you gonna rain again? Otis said it was written in New York City for us dust bowlers. For us, the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression were one and the same. Our harvests were not only small, they brought low prices too. President Roosevelt's New Deal was put into place to provide government help. One program was the WPA, which offered relief to those who were out of work. In our town of Turkey, Texas, many people worked for the WPA by repairing roads. But Papa's pride wouldn't let him accept relief. He believed a person should work for what he got. And he thought the WPA men spent a lot of time leaning on their shovels. The New Deal had a program to help agriculture recover. Farmers had never been paid before not to grow crops, but it was believed that if production went down, prices would go up, so we received parity checks. In 1934, the supply of cows was greater than the demand. To help farmers and raise prices, the government bought cows and shot them. On a clear summer day with no dust in sight, the government men came to our farm, and Papa told us 4 girls to stay in the house with Mama and took the 3 boys with him to the government men to the barn. We heard the guns go off and Mama cried. The Bible says it is a sin to destroy, she said. We were paid $15 for each cow, $8 for each yearling, $2 for each calf, but this was only subsistence money. Despite the hardships, life went on. We attended school during the week and church on Sunday. Children adapted to circumstances, and I accepted this as a way of life. Didn't everyone have dust bowl blowing in their face? Though we had few material possessions, the love of our family was free. Memories of the Dust Bowl are painful, but they are a part of me. I would not trade them. I believe the hardships of those years shaped me into a stronger person. When the stock market crashed, my husband and I were affected immediately. Claude's place of employment was so busy that the workers often had to put in overtime. By the middle of 1932, though, Claude was working only 3 days a week, and we could no longer make the payments on our washing machine. When things got so bad, we could no longer make our house payments. Something had to be done. We didn't want to stand in soup lines or accept welfare, so we decided to try our luck at farming. We decided to move in with Claude's parents, although he'd keep his city job as long as possible. I remembered a time when I had sworn I'd never marry a farmer, but I agreed to try, and we took our 2 small sons to live in the country. For a year, we lived upstairs in my in-laws, leaving our city conveniences behind. I managed to feed our family of 4 on $1 to $1.25 a week. Claude had no watch, so whenever he was working within sight of the house at dinner time, I'd tie a clean white diaper on the end of a broomstick and attach it to the porch railing. To start farming, we needed horses. We found a pair, but had no money to pay for them. The dealer said he'd accept a note if we could come up with a down payment. We didn't have that either, but we did have a vacuum cleaner we couldn't use anymore. Since my in-laws' house had no electricity, the dealer agreed to take it as a down payment. After a year, we had another baby on the way, so we started looking for a place of our own. We heard a nearby farm was for rent, but we were told the buildings weren't much. What an understatement. The house looked like a shack. The barn had a lean, but to no basement. And all the outbuildings had seen better days. I stepped to the kitchen window and saw a ceiling paper hanging almost to the floor. I told Claude I could never live in such a place, but he reminded me there was nothing else available, and after all, we could fix it up. So we moved in, and the landlord offered to plaster the worst walls and ceilings and buy paper to cover the rest, so that took care of that problem. And there was no well on the place, so there was spring bubbling from some distance from the house, and we didn't need the pump water, but we did have to carry it, which was a job not to be taken lightly. We learned to be careful how we used it. After our 3rd son was born, Claude bought a cow for $31 at an auction. Of course, we didn't have the money, but his cousin was at the auction and co-signed the note for him, and we were in the dairy business. At another auction, Claude and his brother bid $10 for 4 tables. One of ours became a washstand, and the other occupied a spot in the living room with a doily hiding the crack at the top. We spent very little for clothes. We wore everything until it wore out, then patched them and wore them some more. The boys' clothes were made almost entirely from cast-offs, but with many hours at the old Singer, I managed to keep the little shavers covered. Improbable as it may seem, less than 2 years after moving into our little shack, we bought it. The bank had foreclosed on our landlord's mortgage, but put the place up for sale for an incredibly small down payment, which we borrowed from a relative. We were able to deal with the bank. All thoughts of returning to the city evaporated. After that, we concentrated on paying off our mortgage and improving our living conditions. In 1936, a well was driven, and we had water just a few feet from our back door. Such a luxury. The following year, we bought a windmill, and then we didn't even have to pump water as long as the wind was blowing. Those few years were very trying, but we survived, and we learned from them, and we're not sorry we experienced them. As Claude once said, we aren't poor, just a little hard up. Gene Bergman, Sand Lake, Michigan. I was in my early teens when the Depression hit. We lived on a farm in Iowa. So even with a family of 6, we were never a shortage of food. We all pitched into canned pork and beef, and we had chicken and eggs, milk, and vegetables from a large garden. Though we didn't go hungry, we did have a problem finding enough money to buy the things we couldn't produce ourselves. When the price of corn dropped to 10 cents a bushel, it was not economically practical to sell, so we could go out and buy expensive coal. There were always plenty of corn cobs to fire the cook stove in the kitchen, but the furnace needed something else. Wood wasn't all that plentiful in the Iowa prairie. My parents decided the sensible thing to do was to burn whole ears of corn in the furnace, much as they hated the thought. I never thought the day my father backed up to the basement window and dumped a wagon load of corn into the furnace room. It turned out to be good fuel, as it held fire well and got us through a long winter. Still, shoveling those big, beautiful ears of corn into the furnace may have been the hardest thing my father ever had to do. It was that winter that his hairs started turning gray. Marjorie Panette's, Berryville, Arkansas. In 1935, I had a birthday I'll never forget. I belonged to a boys' club in the little town of Catherine, Kansas, and had gone to the club big old hall to play a few games of basketball. Suddenly, during the evening, the wind came up with a big whoosh, sifting everyone in the hall with a grayish-brown powder. 4 50-watt light bulbs were strung through the center of the building with pull strings for switches. They all went out. We could barely see where the bulbs were to turn them off, but we didn't need to. The whole town was blacked out. The dust storm had blown down the electrical poles. Our home was about a half a mile from town, as the crow flies, so I decided to take the shortcut. I managed to find my bearings, but I also got the biggest scare of my life. I walked right into my neighbor's fence, which was charged with static electricity, with sparks jumping from the 3 wires, so I followed the sparks home. Gilbert Carlin, Victoria, Kansas. I was only 10 years old in the spring of 1935, but I remember the red dust that blew in from Oklahoma. We lived on a farm in Reno County, Kansas. I'll never forget my mother's instructions for setting the dinner table. Lay all the plates upside down, place the water glasses and coffee cups bottom side up, and place the napkin over the silverware. When we gathered the table, everyone turned their place settings over, and there was a nice clean circle on the checked tablecloth where the dishes had been. The rest of the table was covered with a fine red sand. My father would make jokes about not having to pepper the potatoes and gravy. The milk was always dusty, even after being strained through a cloth, and my father would kid us children about drinking chocolate milk. I thought my parents' good sense of humor helped us get through those days. Lila Williams, Leavenworth, Kansas. I attended a one-room schoolhouse in Kansas, and sometimes when the dust storms came, the whole world seemed darkened. We'd either stay in the schoolhouse, sometimes spending the whole night there, or covered our faces with wet rags and follow the fence lines home. In 1936, my family lost the farm and moved to Colorado. My uncle owned a sawmill camp high in the Rocky Mountains and offered work to my father and two brothers. When I awoke my first morning there, I saw a light covering of snow on the ground, with red ripeness of wild strawberries peeking through. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. Zada Johnson, Boulder, Colorado. All right, guys, that's all for this video. I will see you in the next one. You stay safe, you stay positive, you keep prepping, and as always, fear less.